Now that we've got a little bit of background on the Nancy Drew series and its origins, I want to think about it a little bit more in terms of its historical context and where Nancy Drew is entering into public and social consciousness. Now, while Nancy Drew was and still is the most popular and enduring girl detective from fiction, she is not alone in the genre. Betsy Caprio gives us a sense of Nancy's place in the genre as she explains how Nancy is predated by the Stratemeyer Syndicate's investigative teen heroines of World War I days, such as Ruth Fielding and Dorothy Dale. There's Betty Gordon, Billy Bradley, and other young women who were featured in series in the 1920s, and their appearance parallels the rise in popularity of adult detective fiction. But soon after her birth, Nancy was joined on the book stands by other sister sleuths, Judy Bolton, the Dana Girls, Kay Tracy, Beverly Gray, and aviatrix Dorothy Dixon, among others. By the time the 1940s roll around and World War II focused on career girl detectives, including Connie Blair from the world of advertising, nurse Cherry Ames, and flight attendant Vicky Barr, while you also had younger teen characters like Trixie Belden joining the ranks. Now, with Nancy Drew, one of the reasons why I chose it for this class is that we have an opportunity to learn more about the phenomenon of series books and mass production of fiction for young people. As Nancy Tillman Romalov points out, quote, whether children reading mass-marketed series books should be encouraged or discouraged is the subject of a long-ranging debate. Now, they seem commonplace at this point in the post-Harry Potter world, but series books have been quite popular throughout the 20th century. Certainly it wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that reading became commonplace. Before, it was a marker of class and upbringing and education, but once reading became more commonplace, mass production of books became more commonplace, and more people from every social strata became more likely to read. And so there came a moment in history where class striations were once again put into place to attempt to separate higher and lower social tiers. Romalov explains that the development of the public library in the late 19th century coincided with the rise of popular series books published by those like Stratemeyer. She explains that the public library movement was part of a larger reform effort of the progressive era that sought to shape public behavior. In the course of enacting their mission, public librarians generated a rhetoric of guidance that created and has helped maintain a dichotomy between different types of fiction and reading, between what's variably been labeled popular, i.e. low, subliterary, escapist, trashy, and elite, i.e. edifying, uplifting, artful literature. The public library movement in the United States was established in the mid-19th century on the principles of Americanizing foreigners, controlling social and urban problems, and uplifting readers. According to recent library histories, the public library was originally subsidized by capitalists and political leaders who saw it as a way of extending genteel culture to workers and their children. As such, the library became a social battleground where librarians became a new level of gatekeeping. Once children were permitted to have full lending privileges, something they didn't have at first, the focus drew closer to what kind of fiction should be made available to them. Romalov goes on to explain that the first children's librarians had been trained to view the library as a moral force and felt that it was their duty to make certain that children read nothing but wholesome literature. That's a vague term, to be sure, but one around which librarians could rally. All sides agreed that dime novels, those distant cousins of the Stratemeyer books, story papers, and cheap books had no place in the library's collection, and devised ingenious plans to reform readers found smuggling such literature into the library. Often the debate was drawn along class lines. One librarian explained that children who are born and bred in the habitation of labor cannot, and will not read what I, as a rule, am willing to recommend. As such, you'd find some popular fiction found in libraries located near factories, and many argued that allowing books that, while subliterary, may show a child from the poor class of laborers how well-born people acted and spoke was of value. But these books were still rallied against. Arguments against them included their poor quality, both in fiction and in production. This is where the term pulp fiction becomes a relevant term. Pulp fiction was named after literally the cheap paper that was used to produce the material, magazines and cheap dime store novels. The paper was created from wood pulp, basically the hot dogs of the publication industry, or you get all the runoff refuse from higher quality books. But they also argued that that these types of books would create mental laziness. There was also a recognition of the potential for subversion in these books. Series book heroes were more adult-like than others. They were self-sufficient, heroic, independent, which could lead to feelings of discontent, causing children to dream, perchance to act upon the dreams, or worse, to behave disrespectfully towards adults, as Romanov says. There was also a fear of reading being a gendered behavior, specifically for girls reading boys' adventure stories. G. Stanley Hall, who we'll read more about in our next video, he argued that the danger is very great that the modern schoolgirl will early in life acquire false views of it, which will make excessive and impossible demands on it, which will cloud her life with discontent. Hall argued that girls should read books that fit them for domestic life and womanly vocations, or as we put in the last video, those drawing room skills. Even by the 1920s, the American Library Association had officially stated that they did not recommend series books for young people due to them, quote, being poorly written, sensational, and a waste of time and libraries' money. Librarians were terrified of the popularity of Stratemeyer's books and similar publications. It took well until the 1960s and 70s before series books found their way into libraries. And during the 1930s to the 1960s, children's attentions were dominated by radio, comics, pulp magazines, movies, and TV, which means the moral police were busy fighting against them rather than stuff like Nancy Drew. And so by the 1970s, after a number of educational and literacy movements changed people's thinkings on the matter, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, librarians began to finally defend the child's right to read broadly and freely, favoring instead the idea that pleasure in reading encourages more reading. And as Romanov says, anything that could get them to read and away from the television to them was worth championing. And now, of course, we're fully aware of the preponderance of modern book series that serve as gateways to reading for many children. In the 90s, series like Goosebumps dominated sales. The Harry Potter series was a literacy awakening for many children. And now the most popular books among young people are the ones that allow them to follow along the adventures of the same character for multiple installments. Given the popularity of serialized fiction like The Hunger Games or superhero comic adventures on the page and on the movie screen, we can't really expect series fiction to go away anytime soon.